Hi all. I hope you're staying warm and cozy and safe outside. It's snowing outside my office window right now. I just looked out and saw it. So hope you all are safe. Um, and I'm sorry we missed each other today, but at least we can join through video, or at least connect sort of. I want to go through, this is a lesson we would have talked about today in class. So I'm going to do a lecture video and then I'll assign your homework and things like that. So what I want to talk about today are some basic concepts behind the study of the humanities. These are concepts that will be helpful and useful in underlying all of the discussions and readings and things we undertake throughout the semester, regardless of if we're talking about art or music or stage or screen or literature. These are some basic ideas that underlie all studies of the humanities and how we analyze and interpret what those pieces mean. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to talk about, what are the humanities? These are the condition and quality of being human, rooted in humanism, which is taking a human-centered approach to reality. It stresses human experiences, capabilities, potential, needs, pleasures, desires, and problems. Um, it studies how humans have symbolically create and share meaning as individuals, communities, and cultures through creativity, art, and representation. The emphasis is on an interconnectedness of all human experiences across time and space. Falling in love, survival, grief, grief, risk taking, what comes after death, seeking, belonging, beauty, seeking or losing home, questioning identity. These are all universal human truths and searches, regardless of where we are, whether in geography and time. Um, Comes out of classical humanism from the Renaissance intelligentsia, which believed that studying the humanities disciplines was the only way to be fully human. Now it's the focus on a more diverse, less Eurocentric view, and includes creative and intellectual expressions of each of us as individuals in this class, not just those who are creating serious pieces of art. Studying the humanities is going to have a lot of benefits when it comes to creative cognitive processes in the brain. It comes to a deeper understanding of what it means to be human and enhances critical thinking, recognizing meaning, innovation, and some higher order thinking, which we'll talk about later in the slide. First thing we're going to talk about is creativity and how it defines humanity. Creativity is what we engage in as children. Before memorization, before standardization, we learn by being creative. We build blocks to learn what shapes are. We develop fine motor skills and understanding of color through painting and drawing and things like that. Um, Kids learn through play. We know this. This has been studied when it comes to early childhood education. And now employers, people in higher education, and many others see a need for the higher level thinking found in the humanities. When we're not just memorizing facts, but we're trying to uncover why. What does it mean? Not just when something happened and all of that, but what's the deeper truth underneath it? The goal of creativity is just to let yourself go, create, have fun with it. And by returning to understanding what others learned through their use of creativity, we can find our own again. Another aspect is identity. Rene Descartes, the French philosopher, says, "I think, therefore I am." And this is the underlying question of who am I? It's the central question of me is who am I, and how do I create something that reflects who I am? And the pieces of art and things like that we'll be discussing this semester, a lot of those creators are concerned with the same questions. There's this theory of social identity, which is that a person's self-concept is shaped by social interaction. In other words, we base who we are based on our perception of sameness or differences with others. We're also shaped by social organization and society. We organize ourselves into pre-existing categories based on our interests, where we're from, what we want to do in our lives, what we believe, what we value, our morality, all of these things, as well as things like gender, race, disability, all of these things, sexuality, gender orientation. gender expression. All of these things are things that we develop ourselves and use to understand who we are. Descartes, to return to him, has this concept of an enduring inner self and a mind-body dualism. He thought that our mind and body were separate entities. And humanities, the question of identity comes from this idea of self-expression of who am I is rooted and underscores much of art and creativity and much of what we'll be talking about. Talk about fantasy and imagination, because you can't talk about creativity without talking about that. Um, Imagination is uniquely human ability. It's intentional. It's intentionally dreaming to create new ideas, images, concepts, things that are not present in the existing world. We use our cognitive or mental processes to produce something from within ourselves. So when sometimes if you're writing or you're sculpting or you're painting, someone's like, "Oh, I can't believe you created that from nothing," but you didn't, because what you create comes from yourself, and that's the same for all creators. This idea of magical worlds, fantastical creatures, plans for the future, setting goals, hypothetical reasoning, invention and innovation, developing symbols and meaning, designing new things, maintaining hope, working for a better world. Um, all these things underscore this element of creativity, imagination, and fantasy. There often it comes from a response to a psychological need to solve a problem, escape a situation, enhance a desire, play and have fun for relief from stress. All of these things. And so then the humanities become a platform to bring fantasy and imagination into reality. Painting, sculpture, music, storytelling, dance, architecture, film, television, all of these things are byproducts of these ideas of fantasy and imagination that come from identity, that come from self-concept, that come from thinking and I think, therefore I am. Maybe it's I think, therefore I create. Creativity, invention, and innovation are all creative. The act of turning new imaginative ideas into reality, creation of new ideas and concepts, turning a new concept into a widespread use or commercial success. All these things are all shaped out of just letting ourselves have an imagination, have fantasy, think outside of just memorizing facts for a test, and think, what can I do with this information? How is this going to shape the world around me? How is this going to shape the future? How is this going to benefit humanity? How's it going to benefit me? All of those things. This idea of creativity and fantasy connects humans through the barriers of time and space, or connects us across barriers of language and culture. Um, Carl Jung, psychotherapist, said that we have structures of conscious mind shared across beings of the same species. These archetypal ideas, these archetypes show up regardless of which society or culture is creating something and when they're creating it. So time and space and location are no real barriers to creativity because according to Jung, we all have these ideas and they show up everywhere. This idea of the caregiver, the ruler, the artist, the innocent, the jester or the prankster, the hero, the magician, the outlaw, the lover. These are all things that show up throughout art, throughout literature, throughout music, regardless of the society. These can be maybe sacred, religious, or spiritual stories, traditional narratives passed down through generations, life lessons or cultural systems of thoughts and values. They may be explanations of why something exists, such as suffering. Um, all of these myths, sorry, all these myths come into play throughout everything, regardless of culture. Sometimes they may be interpreted differently. Cultures will have different practices, but the same underlying question and idea. There are other things, monomyths, there are archetypal myths that repeat across history and culture, such as creation stories. All of these are ways that people make sense of the world around them. And they're the underscore of what the humanities are and offer. course, there's a search for truth. The integral search for truth underlies much of the humanities. What is true? What is the meaning of life? What is not true? What is false? How do I decide the difference or decode the difference? How do I decide what's true for me? Not just truths and facts and statistics. Here we're looking for that inner truth, that and a universal human truth, which also leads to this idea that those in power can dictate how people view truth beneath them. Michel Foucault, a 20th century French philosopher, said systems of power shape our social and cultural understandings of truth. Um, they shape our social and cultural systems and frame how we see the world, the words we use, um, how we view morality and rules, what's right and wrong, comes from systems of power. Xuanzi, Chinese philosopher who is behind a lot of Taoist thought, ancient China in around 4th century BCE, said that it comes from perspective, that one's linguistic and conceptual perspective dictates what one claims to know. In other words, we decide what we believe based on what we experience. There's a parable of a group of people who cannot see who are examining an elephant. The person holding the trunk says, well, this must be something like a snake. It's flexible, it moves, it's soft. Someone who's holding who touches just a leg says this must be a tree. It's a giant tree trunk. Someone on top says it might be like a bush or bristly. Someone who just has the tail says it's just the rope. None of them are seeing everything because they're limited by their perspective. Studying the humanities seeks to broaden that element, broaden our perspectives to not just our own perspective and experience, but to understand what others perceive and experience as well. Of course, this leads to morality and social justice and truth. How do we view what is just? Speaking truth to power, so this nonviolent tactic against histories or propaganda produced by systems of power dates back to classical Greece and free speech. It's used by activists sharing their truth to confront or break monopoly of knowledge by those in power. It's also this idea of truth and reconciliation, uncovering and revealing past wrongdoing to resolve leftover conflict, prevent history from repeating itself. And then all of this underscores this idea of creative thinking or critical thinking. How do we decide and interpret what something means and why it means something and its significance and why is it significant? All of these elements. The humanities allows us to move past stereotypes and understand the complexity of groups of people and people as individuals, and allows us to broaden our views beyond only what we need, practical, in the moment concerns, and allows for a deeper understanding of everything and everyone around us, drawing on our experiences and ideas to enrich our lives beyond just a moment. And allows us to look beyond momentary emotion to critically reflect on the art forms beyond their parts, their creation, technique, and context, what triggers that emotion, what is its lasting impact. There's a lot of focus between Apollonian, sorry, or intellectual response. I just noticed a typo on this slide, where it says Apollo emotional, that should be Apollo rational or dream. In other words, Apollo was the god of the sun. His focus was on truth, light, and logic. His focus is on rational thinking, rationality. What does this mean and why? Not what I'm feeling about it, but I'm using my brain here. When it comes to Dionysus, who's the Greek god of wine, festivals, and madness, he thrived on chaos and irregularity in mythology. However, in blurring the boundaries of who we are in nature, the world around us. This is our emotional responses. Not just saying, oh, I don't like that. I'm not going to look at it. Or, oh, I love that. So it's automatically the best thing ever made. But taking both of those, the emotion and the thought, the mad and the rational, the logical and the emotional, and reconciling how we view something, the combination of the two. That's where critical thinking comes from. Not just discount. Sometimes I think we try to discount emotion and our emotional gut feeling response and reaction and just focus on thought, or we just focus on that emotional reaction and we don't do any deeper thinking. Critical thinking, especially when it comes to the humanities, but honestly, in anything, takes both. So, how do we respond critically? And this is something you're going to keep in mind, regardless of what we're looking at, regardless of the discipline under the humanities we're studying at the time, anything like that. The first thing we're going to talk about are some steps to critical response. First thing, you're going to define what you're responding to. What makes this episode of this television series so impactful? What makes this movie impactful? Why does it mean something? What makes this piece of art so significant? Why do we look at something as this is a canonical piece of art and classic sculpture, and why should we pay attention to that as opposed to something else? Acknowledge your instinctive and emotional reactions. How did it make me feel? What is my gut reaction? What could be underscoring or underlying that emotional reaction and why? Um, because we don't come to things as a blank slate. When we are looking at anything, any piece of art, any ideas, anything, we bring all of our old biases and experiences into play. Um, this idea of being curious over judgment, and this idea that I want to be curious to understand why I'm feeling this instead of judging myself for feeling that way. Why do I feel that way? What about my background is adding to how I interpret something? Collect information, background and intent. How can I find out what the artist was trying to do with this craft and their craft process? Um, there's a lot of information out there. Be willing to look outside of a piece. Look at it in context. What was going on in the time period, society, traditions of that art form to impact how this was? Um, when novels came out, they were considered trashy. So if I'm looking at a novel written around that's one of the first novels written, I have to have that in mind, that context. Um, if I'm looking at a creation story, I need to know when did it start showing up, what culture, all of those things. Is this someone who is breaking the rules when it comes to how literature and language is put together, or how the structure of poetry happens? And how can I then turn that around and understand how that shapes the work? Accepting characters and others, creators, characters, or ideas that are unlike ourselves. How can I understand these people, even if on the surface we have nothing in common? Um, how can I learn about them to understand why they're creating something this way, even if they're very different from my experiences? And you want to form your opinion based on evidence. There is a focus on opinion. What makes something a dramatic piece of art for me may look like nothing to someone else. Um, so you're going to have some evidence that shapes that. Use the information you've gathered combined with your initial emotional response to form an idea or decide what you want to say about a work. Take those in balance, take those together. Some people prefer sculpture, some people prefer painting, some people prefer sketch, some people are really into digital art right now. Take that, all that is going to add to your emotional response, take that in context, and that's how you shape your response. So I know that was kind of a quick run through. As always, if you have questions, please let me know. And I will see you next week as long as the weather's better. Have a wonderful week and stay safe.